I'm very honored to introduce our first speaker on this historical tone session, Cathryn Yang, intermediate stages on the pathway of proto-glottal stop to rising evidence from Ngwi, Loloish. I'm going to mute myself now. And our band will play the video for us. Go ahead, Ben.
Cathryn, do you want to say anything else, or do you want me to just go ahead and start the presentation?
Yes, go ahead. I just have some noise issues. That's why we're playing the recorded video, but I am available afterwards for the questions. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Hi, and thanks for coming to my talk. So the question this study addresses is, how do rising tones evolve? How does a rising F0 contour become phonologized as a contrastive tone? And the problem is, phonetic tone change is notoriously unpredictable. So across a language branch, there can be this wild diversity of phonetic tone values reflecting a single historic tone category. And we don't yet have an adequate way to interpret that wild variation. There's just so much we don't know about how tone pitch, height, and contour change over time. A possible way forward for tone change research is to first zoom in to a shallower time depth to look at variation within a group of very closely related languages or dialects of the same language. This concept is called the dialect laboratory. It's using dialects as a testing ground for proposed pathways to sound change. So I assemble a dialect laboratory of tonal reflexes in the Ngwi, also called Loloish language branch. In the present study, I'm looking only at low stopped and high stopped tones in Ngwi, which I will refer to simply as low and high. These are Proto-Ngwi's historically checked tones occurring in syllables ending with a stop. Now, in most Ngwi languages, syllable final stops merge to a syllable final glottal stop. The laryngeal event that Hadricourt 1954 directly links to the emergence of rising. But I'll be presenting evidence from the Ngwi dialect laboratory that show a slightly more complicated pathway than the one proposed by Hadricourt. So variation that we observe in lower level Ngwi language clusters reveal several intermediate stages between syllable final glottal stop and the emergence of a rising tone. First, syllable final glottal stop conditions tense phonation on the preceding vowel. That tense phonation conditions raising of F0 across the whole vowel, which leads to the tone becoming a high tone, by which I mean having a tonal target in the upper pitch range, and finally, that high tone becomes a rising tone. Now, identifying this more detailed pathway from syllable final glottal stop to rising could help us interpret the wild dialect variation that we see in other Sino-Tibetan language branches, and perhaps even across the Sinosphere. Let's begin with a quick overview of the Proto-Ngwi tone system. So Proto-Ngwi had a 3+1 system with 3 tonal contrasts occurring in smooth syllables ending in a vowel or nasal, numbered as 1, 2, and 3, and a 4th category for syllables ending in a stop. Proto-Ngwi underwent a tone split in 4 according to prefix and initial type. This follows the voiced low principle, so it became low stopped after voiced initials and or voiced prefixes, and high stopped after voiceless initials or voiceless prefixes. So in almost all Ngwi languages, those syllable final stops merge to syllable final glottal stop, which then condition tense phonation on the preceding vowel. So low falling 2-1 tense and mid-level 3-3 tense, and the underline here is indicating tense phonation on the preceding vowel. These are very common reflexes for low and high across different Ngwi language clusters. Now, the split in tone 4 created a system in which phonation is orthogonal to pitch. So phonation is cross-cutting with pitch, meaning that a mid-pitch syllable, a 3-3 syllable, and a low-pitch 2-1 syllable, both of them could occur with either tense or modal phonation. Now, the dialect laboratory shows us recurring tone variation patterns, but it doesn't tell us how to interpret those patterns as evidence of tone change. For that interpretation to be phonetically grounded, we need to incorporate findings from synchronic phonetic studies and ongoing tone change studies. So first, tense phonation is a typological feature of most Ngwi languages. Tense phonation is produced with increased longitudinal tension in the vocal folds, and this increased tension is associated with higher F0. So figures 1 and 2 show the acoustic analyses of tone in Nisu and Lalo, respectively. The tense tones, H and L, are significantly higher in F0 than their modal counterpart tones, tone 3 and tone 2. Similar reports are given for other Ngwi languages like Lolo and Ashi. Now, this suggests that tense phonation has a raising effect on F0 in Ngwi languages. The second relevant finding of phonetic tone studies is that in connected speech, high tonal targets often require an initial rise. So to reach high, you often have to begin with a rise. Figure 3 shows F0 trajectories of 2-syllable sequences in Mandarin Chinese, where the second syllable is a high level tone, that is tone 1. Now observe the various shapes of the F0 trajectory in the second syllable. Most of them involve an initial rise. The F0 offset of the preceding syllable determines the F0 onset of the following syllable. This means that if the first syllable ends low or mid, the second syllable will necessarily have to rise to reach its high tone target. And the high tone target may not be reached until the last half of the syllable. Now, in free speech, there's sometimes insufficient time to reach a high tone target within the allocated temporal domain. When that happens, the truncated variant of high is simply rising. So there's this phonetic precursor for high to become rising. Third, real and apparent time tone change studies show that high level and high rising falling tones tend to become rising tones over time. For example, figure 4 is the acoustic analysis of Bangkok Thai tone 4 over the past 100 years. So Bangkok Thai tone 4, this is also called the high tone or C4. It was a high rising falling tone in 1908, but through the 20th century, it gradually changed into a rising tone. So the phonetic studies and the tone change studies are both pointing to high becoming rising. And that high tone can be high level or high rising falling. So what we're seeing here is that the high target tends to get realized later and later in the syllable across successive generations, so that the peak, the F0 peak appears to slide to the right over time. And this mechanism in tone change is called peak sliding by Pittayaporn, 2007-2018. So far, we have established phonetic mechanisms that contribute to tense becoming high and high becoming rising. So we're now ready to enter the Ngwi dialect laboratory, where the data consists of word lists and or historical analysis from various sources for over 80 language varieties, organized into 14 lower level clusters. And these are shown on the map by different colored dots. This is a map of Southwest China, which is where most Ngwi speakers are located. I'll be presenting patterns of variation in 5 lower level clusters: Nosoit, Sanoid, Lysoid, and Loloid. and in the interest of time, I will limit the discussion to these 5. First stop, the Loloish Cluster in western Yunnan. We'll be zooming into the Lalo homeland and population center in Dali Prefecture. This map shows an innovation in Low spreading through a small geographic area. Different stages of the innovation are seen in different Lalo varieties. So the tone Low reflex is 2/1/10 in most varieties, and this is the conservative reflex of the Low tone. We also find a slightly higher 3/1/10 in Qingyun, a central Lalo dialect, and even higher 4/2 to the west in Ilu village. This is a western Lalo dialect. We also find that in Ilu, tense phonation has given way to modal phonation with an occasional syllable final glottal stop. Now proceeding to the north, to other western Lalo dialects, to the north of Ilu, we find a high rising falling 4/5/3 with an occasional glottal stop in Shuizhuping village, and finally a 4/5 rising tone with occasional glottal stop in Dutian. Now we come to the most important slide in the whole talk. Figure 5 is the acoustic analysis of Low in various Lalo dialects based on one speaker for each location. So F0 has been converted to semitones relative to each speaker's mid-level tone so that we can compare across speakers. The dotted lines show that tense phonation is retained in Yong'an and Qingyun, 2 central Lalo villages. The solid lines represent modal phonation in western Lalo with optional syllable final glottal stop. I am arguing that the different reflexes seen in Lalo dialects represent a gradual pathway from 2/1/10 through to 4/5 modal with occasional syllable final glottal stop. This gradational pathway is in accordance with the phonetic precursors that we found in the phonetic studies and the tone change trends that are observed in the variationist studies, real time and apparent time. A tense phonation conditions higher F0, leading to a mid-falling tone. This is seen in the second to the left box in central dialect of Qingyun, and a high falling tone in western Lalo, the 4/2 seen in Ilu village. The high falling tone acquires an initial rise, becoming a high rising falling tone that we see in Shuizhuping. Finally, the final fall is truncated, leaving a simple rising tone as seen in Dutian village. Now, a direct link between syllable final glottal stop and a rising tone that would really only work here for Dutian village. It would fail to account for the other reflexes of Low that we see in other Lalo dialects. Now you might say at this point, that's just one language cluster. That might be an idiosyncratic development in Lalo. So let's look at what happens in other language clusters. So we're moving on now to the Nosoit Cluster. This is also called Eastern Yi. These are the, sometimes it's referred to the largest dialect, which is called Nasu. The autonym is Nasu, and its related languages and dialects. So even though the Nosoit cluster is not in contact with Lalo, the pattern of variation is still similar to what we saw in Lalo. 3 varieties show a conservative reflex of the Proto-Ngwi Low, that is, they are showing 2/1/10 or 2 stopped, 2 short. Then we see several varieties that show a high tense tone. One of them Lowu Nisu shows a high tone with occasional tense phonation. The 3 locations show a low rising modal tone. Now, unlike the Lalo data, we just don't have acoustic analysis for many of the Nasu dialects. So figure 6 is showing the acoustic analysis of Low in 2 Nosoid varieties, Lowu Nisu and Lawu Nisu. So the Lowu Nisu tone Low shows a high tone, which is only sometimes realized with tense phonation, while Lawu Nisu shows a low rising tone with modal phonation. Now, interestingly, the Lawu Nisu were sent out from the Nasu homeland. They were sent as soldiers to Dali in the early Ming Dynasty, so they have been separated from other Nasu speakers for about 700 years. So even though we don't have the fine-grained detail that we did with the Lalo data, the overall pattern of variation is still the same. That is, we're seeing correspondence pattern of tense corresponding to high, corresponding to rising. Now for the Nosoit cluster, this is also called Northern Yi, located in northern Yunnan and southern Sichuan. So in Proto-Nosu, tone Low had already become a high tense tone, and this is still seen across the Nosoid area. However, one location, Yinua, shows an innovative rising tone. So the Nosoid cluster is showing the last step in the pathway, that is high becoming rising. Moving on to the Sano Cluster in southeastern Yunnan, this is also called southeastern Yi. The Sano Cluster shows a tone split in Low, in which glottal stop and S prefixes conditioned a high tense tone in most locations, with one variety, Aja, showing an innovative high rising tone. So very similar to the Nosoid cluster, where we see high and rising right next to each other. And finally, let's take a look at the Lysoid cluster. This includes Lisu, Lipo, Lolo, and 2 recent additions to the cluster, Limi and Jingu Limi. Now the Lysoid cluster doesn't show any rising tone reflexes for Low, but it does for high. Lolo and Lipo varieties maintain a conservative reflex of 3/3 tenths for high, but Jingu Limi shows a tendency for high to be realized as a high tone, tense or modal, and Lisu shows a tone split with a mid-high level after various historic prefixes, and with a rising 3/5 in most other environments. So again, we see a correspondence pattern of tense, high, and rising, much like in the other cluster's reflexes for Low. So to summarize, the Ngwi dialect laboratory shows multiple clusters having the same correspondence pattern of tense corresponding to high, corresponding to rising. Based on the phonetic studies as well as the real-time and apparent time studies, I interpret this correspondence pattern as showing intermediate stages on the pathway from coda glottal stop to rising tone. Now in Haudricourt's 1954 model of tonogenesis, he posits a direct pathway from a syllable final glottal stop to a rising tone, as F0 of the vowel is raised in anticipation of the coda glottal stop. When the glottal stop disappears, the rising tone becomes contrastive. Now, the present study cannot directly critique his proposal for 2 reasons. First, Haudricourt was talking about tonogenesis. That's the process by which a non-tonal language becomes tonal, whereas I'm talking about tone change in an already tonal system. So they have different factors that are influencing the sound change process. And 2, Hadricourt was talking about a different tone category. He is referring to the tone category that corresponds to the Chinese shang tone, while I'm talking about the tone that corresponds to the Chinese ru, or the Thai tone D. Even so, there are reasons to critically revisit the idea of this straight shot from syllable final glottal stop to rising tone contour. And that is, first, synchronic phonetic studies of syllable final glottal stop's effect on F0 show inconsistent results. Some languages show a raising effect, some show a lowering effect, some show no effect whatsoever of syllable final glottal stop on F0. Second, Hadricourt's proposal is trying to explain a change that took place a long time ago at a very great time depth. Now, Hadricourt successfully established the historic presence of a syllable final glottal stop. That's not in question. And we can easily establish a point in the past or present when the tone had a rising contour. So diachronic evidence of the two endpoints is solid. However, that does not necessarily mean there is only one step between the beginning point and the end point. So many phonetic details are lost to us when the change has occurred at such a great time depth. What if, at least in some cases, the process involved a gradational pathway in which glottal stop and rising contour are actually several steps apart? And that is what the present study's results seem to be suggesting. For the low and high tones in Ngwi, syllable final glottal stop conditioned tense phonation. In some language clusters, the F0 raising effect of tense phonation conditioned change to a high tone, which was later reinterpreted as a rising tone. Now, the next step, of course, is to test this proposed pathway in other dialect laboratories across the sinosphere. Tense phonation is kind of an unusual feature of Ngwi languages, so the earlier stages of this proposed pathway may not be found to be applicable to other languages, but I think the later stage of high becoming rising will be found to be a common type of phonetic tone change in other East and Southeast Asian tone languages. Thank you.
All right. So thank you so much for that great presentation. And I'm sure we are, intrigued, all of us are intrigued by it. And I'm sure we have many also questions. So we have about, we are supposed to start our next session at 6:45. So we have about 7 minutes for question and answer. And if I don't see you, please type in the chat rooms that I can just call on you. And I'm going to mute myself again.
Hi, that was a fantastic presentation. Say about implications for the rest of the tonal system in these changes. So like the tonal inventory and other Sandy processes and things.
I'm sorry, I just missed the first part of the question.
Yeah, what implications does this tone change from, especially the high to rising have on the rest of the tone system? So the rest of the tonal inventory and Sandy processes and other things you might have observed.
Oh, that's a big question. You have a good point. That is that tone is kind of a small space, really. These are systems that I'm talking about that have, 3 to 7 tonemes, tone categories. And so any change that happens in one of those tones might feed into shift, chain shift. Like, for example, the Lalo tone example that I was giving, the one where Dutian had an innovative rising tone. You also see at the same time that the Proto-Lalo high-level tone moves down and merges with the tense mid tone. So you get this innovative 4/4 kind of mid-high pitch. And that might have, I hate to say, I don't know how I feel about push or pull, but there might have been a change shift going on where that upper pitch range was getting a bit crowded. Does that answer your question? About tone sandy, ooh, I don't even dare to touch that area, except to say that some of the Ngwi languages that I have worked with, like a dialect of Hani, we see that the monosyllables are moving, like the monosyllable high level has become a rising tone, but in a two-syllable compound, when it's the first syllable, it has not changed. It's still high level. So the two-syllable compounds are more conservative than the monosyllables. Yeah, that is, wow, that is really a, I hope I'm addressing your question.
I'm just happy with anything you might have seen. Thank you. That was a really wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Samson. Thanks for the question. I have comment, but I think I'll give to the audience.
Was there another one in the chat?
Well, it's like a writing, like Yuan Lee said that one thing that might be relevant. I remember reading about the development of tongue in Nardine languages, and it had very much to do with a similar kind of phonation and historical collateralized consonants, with some languages taking high, low tone depending on the phonation type. Might be worth checking out. Kingston 2005. All right, thank you, Yuan Lee.
Yes, thanks so much. This is actually a point that Graham Thurgood brings up in his work on tonogenesis, which is we need a finer, more fine-grained description, fine-grained typology of what syllable final glottal stop really is, because we do see these kind of opposite effects on pitch. Because creaky phonation, right, that's associated with low pitch. But what I'm finding here is that these Ngwi languages are not, well, tense phonation might be like a subcategory of creaky. That's how Keating, Patricia Keating has classified it. So it would help to know the real detailed phonetics of phonation, which that's also really complicated stuff, because phonation doesn't necessarily, it's not just at one point. The time is a dynamic. Time occurs over the course of the rhyme or the rest of the syllable. So, oh, that's a good one too.
Yeah, we have about 1 minute. Anyone want to pitch in, or actually I have an observation. You said somewhere that truncated variants of height is sort of like the genesis, or in a way, of like rising tone, and I wonder that truncated variant of L would be like the falling tone, in that similar situation.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yes. I feel like there is this connection between low and falling, just like there is high and rising. I would like to be able to prove that with this data, but there are very few low-level tones in Ngwi languages. Like almost every low that I can find is always low falling.
All right, thanks so much. So let's give applause to, I don't know how to do those like fancy thing in my computer. So thanks so much, Cathryn, and we look forward to more of your work, and please keep us posted.
Thanks.